Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Marr. I'm the director of the Barnum Museum here in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And thank you so much for joining us. I hope you're a repeat visitor. If you're not, welcome to the channel. But today we have a very wonderful program for you, one that is actually long in the making. With us today is the esteemed scientist and artist, Joe Mullins. Joe is an instructor at the New York Academy of Art and also an adjunct professor at George Mason University down in Washington, D.C. Now, we've worked with Joe in the past, and maybe some of you have seen the video of his work in recreating the face of the Barnum Museum's mummy. If not, their video will be linked in the description below, so you can jump to that after you watch us right now. But what we found from that video was there was an enormous swell of questions about the recreation of our mummy's face. We wanted to sort of backtrack a little bit and answer some of those really interesting questions. Some of you asked about the mummy in the collection, and if it was real, what did we know about it? Well, the basic story is that the Barnum Museum has had the mummy and its coffin in its collection going all the way back to 1894, when it was presented to P.T. Barnum's wife, Nancy Fish Barnum. It was presented to her from the American consulate to Egypt. And interestingly, Barnum himself was already dead at this point. He dies in 1891, but he leaves his final museum, which is where we are today. And it was titled the Barnum Institute of Science and History. And it was specifically that. And today we still have many of the collections from those early days of donations to the museum. And one, of course, is our mummy. Fast forwarding a little bit, when I arrived in the late 1990s to the Barnum Museum, it was always a fascination. There wasn't a lot of investigation to this mummy and coffin that were on display. So with technology advancing the way it has in the world, and our access readily available to scholars in the field, in the early 2000s, we were able to pursue some of these very basic museum questions regarding the specimen. And we reached out to the anthropologist and bioimaging department at Quinnipiac University, who are neighbors, half an hour up the street from here. And Ron Beckett and Jerry Conlog were able to come and help work with us to confirm what we had in the collection. It was quite interesting what we found out, because people in the 1960s had read the hieroglyphics on the coffin. Nobody assumed, which was typical in the 19th century, that the mummy and the coffin did not start the afterlife together, that these could be two completely different moments in time that we were looking at, and we determined basically through our scientific investigations that was the case. Again, fast forward, right before COVID, right in about 2019, we were introduced to Joe, and we began working with this class of the Academy of Art to really breathe life into this ancient person. We learned with our Quinnipiac connections that the mummy was not a man, that it was a woman, that the woman lived about 4,000 years ago, not 2,500 years ago, which is what the coffin said. So these were extraordinary discoveries. So we have quite a few videos on all of this. And again, we're going to link them in the description so you could enjoy those at your pleasure. But what we found when we did the very specific video with Joe, that there were some thought-provoking comments. But in response to some of the questions, what we decided we had, because there's thousands of them, we weeded through an assortment and tried to drill down on a number of questions that were consistent through some of the comments that were left. And Joe, I hope you wouldn't mind. I'm going to ask you some of these questions now, and you can illuminate the information with your knowledge about what you've seen and what you know through the art and the science that you have come to execute on so many skulls, so many specimens. So let me just set the stage. What are the factors when you're going through the process of recreating a face from a skull? You know, for you, what are the factors you consider when making the decisions about the final appearance of the reconstruction, knowing we gave you all the information about our mummy prior, so you knew what you were dealing with. But what are those decisions that you actually, consider when you're recreating a specimen?
First of all, thank you. This is, I think you mentioned in the opening remarks, this is a long time coming, this type of explanation. So I jumped at the opportunity to, I was excited to hear there's so many questions and interest about this process. So happy to be here. The process, now this, it's a little bit different. Most of the cases I deal with these are unidentified remains from ME's offices across the US dealing with, the worst case scenario, homicide victims, unidentified, that kind of thing. But this one, doing the historical cases, it's a little bit of it's less pressure going in. This is not for identification or to solve a mystery of who done it, but it's still as soon as that's feeling passes, then the pressure of it's like, well, it's still a face to our history that I still have to accurately portray. So making sure I have all that information, as much details as I can get from whoever's giving me this gold, you guys with Jerry, the anthropologist, yourself, everybody, and all the history behind where it came from, and the time frame to help do some research, make sure I still have to represent who she was 4,000 years ago, and what she looked like, and put a face to that history. So just having all those details, the age range, male or female, characteristics from the face, like how that would portray into the soft tissue, have all that laid in front of me so I can start the process and rebuild the face.
That's fascinating. And you deal very often, I mean, we were able to provide you with the information, but you deal very often with no knowledge of gender or date or whatever it might be. So quite a few of the viewers were asking questions going back about soft tissue and cartilage, and even the healthy environment that any one person might have lived through at that time. So how did their diet impact their lifestyle, and what evidence might you consider when you're making those decisions? What is interesting, a few people not knowing that this was an Egyptian woman, some people saying, well, she looks Indigenous American. So I thought that was also an interesting observation.
Right. You have to factor in the environment. For instance, I was involved with some historical cases with the Smithsonian, and I had an opportunity to go and was doing some research and looking at some of their collections. And for the diet, for example, which you mentioned, there's so much gristle and stuff in their diet that their teeth were all worn down, and they're not going to be probably overly obese. Those factors we have to make sure we portray the right environment that this person would have lived in 4,000 years ago to best portray, how everybody looked back then. And having all those details is that map that's going to help get to that destination of making sure we put the right face on there. But you do have to factor in as much details as you can.
That was one of the viewers actually said that, wondering if somebody 4,000 years ago tended to be leaner and experience famine due to plagues, contamination. This is what the viewer was saying, especially in the Nile area. So those cultural differences really factor in when you're looking at this, what might have been taking place culturally, environmentally, when a person walked the earth.
Right. You have to factor in if this was somebody of some high ranking in the society, then they probably had a little bit more access to, a better diet than others. So all those things you have to factor into the equation and making sure you're putting the best face forward.
Okay, I won't even go there. But yeah, I understand that. So is there ever a moment, not particularly with our mummy, where DNA profiles come into consideration when you're thinking about this? We don't have DNA from our mummy. Maybe someday, maybe that's our next attempt. But does a DNA marker evidence help you?
It would be helpful. There's DNA has come along, in the 23 years that I've been doing this as a forensic artist, is make so many monumental leaps forward with the technology. And there's phenotypes where you're able to get DNA from a skull and give you a gradient scale for tissue, for your skin tone, for your eye color, for your hair color, whether they have freckles, all those
Yeah.
nuances and details of the face, but it's an expensive test, and most of the cases, forensic, identified cases that I'm working on don't have that in their budget. And if you think about it, where these remains are found, it's always going to be in some rural wooded area in the middle of nowhere, and some small jurisdiction's not going to have thousands of dollars to spend on some DNA test. So, but in this case, it's so 4,000-year-old case. I don't know how it probably be a test to get a good sample from the skull, but it might, one of these days get to see some parameters for a skin tone, hair color, eye color, which would be great. We can
Yeah.
easily go back and modify the face.
Yeah, well, honestly, when you think about how far from just my time at the Barnum Museum, how far, science has advanced to give us the information we had. I mean, in the 25 years that we've been really working on this, there was no story about who this person was, let alone the person represented on the coffin. So fast forward a couple of decades, we've got this story of two, or partial stories of two human journeys from thousands of years ago. Here's another interesting question that might fit into there. How do you decide how thick to make the layers of tissue on the cheeks, on the lips? If your project looks a certain way, and I know that she's behind you, would there be another artist who might come up with different assessments, calculations regarding the final result?
There's tissue depth markers, the tissue depth studies that are used is basically, an average of all the, landmarks on the face. There's sometimes different, depending on what data set you use, there's, 25, 30 some points on the skull that will dictate, how thick the tissue is on these. And these are the study we used was done on living individuals, with an ultrasound pen to come up with those averages based on age range and your ancestry to give you these average steps. Now, those are very loose guideline. You let the 4,000 years ago and all those other factors, including that basic parameters to work within for how much tissue to add. And it's a very loose guideline. Even the data set we use is sometimes it fits depending on the size. The more robust skull, the tissue depth is going to match pretty spot on. But sometimes you just have to use them sparingly, and as you're putting the face on, let the skull dictate the direction of where you're going to go and how much you're going to factor in that information you have for that tissue depth data. But there's a few different data sets, so depending if that'd be a great experiment, to have a couple different artists give them the parameters for the face and see how similar they are. But in theory, people that do this for a living all should follow the same parameter. So I would venture to say somebody at my level, all the faces would still look similar. They would look related at least.
That's really interesting. Somebody also asked, how do you decide how to place the jawbone? We know that our mummy, her jawbone is intact. So when you started working with a 3D model, you had that information, but if the jawbone drops, how do you decide where to place it? Because if it's dropped a little, it might elongate the face. Am I articulating this person's question?
Yeah, that's a great question. And aligning the jaw, without the clay that's applied to the mask, if I had just a cranium and a mandible, the two pieces, if you think about it, when you put those two together, it's just a matter of wiggling them together, because as you bite, your teeth automatically line up. It's like all you have to do is kind of wiggle it around, and it snaps right into place. That's relatively easy to determine, making sure to get the end. As we drop it just a little bit, because nobody really sits around with their teeth.
Yeah, I do every day.
Yeah, if you are, that's
no
stress, too much stress. So you want to make that adjustment and pop it open just in a normal expression or everyday kind of relaxed position. So we wouldn't do it with the mouth like wide open or dropped, unless there was something unique about the teeth. Then we would show that dentition. So
now a number of people were asking about the ears, the ear shape, the attachment to the ears, the nose, and the eyelid folds. also. Just, going through your process, wondering exactly, how you make those decisions.
So the way that those are great, ears and nose, or the cartilage, those are great, and especially those details with the fold in the eyes. Those are great questions. Ears, you have limited information on particularly the ear. You have three bits of information that a skull will tell you about an ear. You get the height of the ear. Now this is my favorite thing to do. You take your finger, stick it on your eyebrow, your thumb at the base of your nose, and if you roll that back, that's about how tall your ear is. Now, and the angle of your ears based on the backside of your mandible, and whether you have attached or detached earlobes is based on your mastoid process, which is that hard bone back here behind your ear, where that is pointing. So, but that's it. All the inner workings of your ear that's like fingerprints. It's very unique to each individual. So the way forensic anthropology works basically is they've studied thousands of skulls, and these features translated into say 83% of the time these are what we found to make those predictions for the nose and for the ears. But there's always going to be those unique faces. Now those unique faces are the ones you see that probably catch your attention when you're out walking in public. See somebody with big ears or small ears or a big nose, they're going to fall outside that norm, and that's a unique identifier, but that is something that we would miss in this facial approximation process. We only can base it on the information that we have in front of us. We can't use an artistic license. And for the nose, if you get your nose, there's averages for the width of your nose. And you can see on the internal structure of the nose, like where the top of your nostrils is. There's a nasal spine. I'm always poking at my face here. You put your finger here and you push up, that's your nasal spine, and that acts like an arrow to tell us which way your nose is pointing. There's a two tangent rule where you can use toothpicks really where they intersect will give you the tip of the nose, but so you can tell which way it's going.
Talking about the features itself, there are certain points on the face, whether it's the eyebrows or the cheekbones. It's like, what do you use as the primary markers to really create a face? And we talked a little bit about the lip of the eyelid, which is so, I would think, so hard to determine because everybody's eyes are so so different in shape.
Yeah, so your skull, if you think about it, your skull is the foundation that you are built on. So what that means is it translates into the soft tissue of everything about the projection of your nose. We talked about the ears, the information you get for the ears, down to the thickness of your lips, the corners of your mouth, the projection of your nose, where your eyebrow is, where your hairline is, even down to the detail of how your folds, it goes over your eyelid, it goes over your eyeball. That's in the deepest part of the location of the deepest part of the upper rim of the orbit. If I was to had a skull and I was to jam my finger up inside the orbit, where that deepest part is dictates how that folds goes over your eye. So just crazy amount of details into how everybody looks based on the skull.
So, so when you think about, well, specifically, let's say with Egyptian people, is there more of an eyelid visible than a Chinese mummy who might not necessarily have that?
Sure, you better see that's the information we would get from the biological profile from the anthropologist will give us that ancestry information. So you mentioned the three main, so a mongoloid or Asian skull would have that kind of it's really kind of a concave face, and you have to incorporate that where that epicanthic fold is tucked under. You can't see that fold, but that's information we would have on the front end. So with her, we didn't see that Asian mongoloid influence. So we could get that
cross off the list, so you don't have to.
That's a feature we did not need to incorporate.
Interesting, really interesting. And this is something that the viewers would not have necessarily seen or known from our early imaging that we did. We do know during the mummification process, we all know that the brain is pulled out. Now we know that her cribriform was blasted through. So it was significant damage, right? So it was all pulled through. Would that injury, that impact to the skull, have impacted any of this region, do you think, in your recreation?
I didn't see any of that. I mean, we have the CT scan, you can see that's
Yeah,
internal
exactly.
from that. But if there was nothing, to the structure of the face was intact. All that would have been like, post-mortem after, so that would have.
Right.
But if there was,
Right.
if I could see where, they broke the nose, or say the skull was dropped at some point during its, collected, then we'd be able to see that and know that
Okay.
was happened, after their death, and we could compensate, rebuild the face in a digital environment and make those adjustments.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So that trauma to her actual skull was not evident to you with the 3D model that you actually had to work on.
I could see it on the inside. I could see it on the inside, but it didn't.
Right.
There's nothing that affected the outward
recreation.
appearance.
Really interesting. I've actually wondered that. Now, you just mentioned graphics. One of the questions that came up, a number of viewers were wondering about technology. Can computer simulations do the same work? Are there particular nuances that you can achieve as an artist that can't necessarily be captured through a computer reconstruction?
As of right now, today, there's no software that automatically, sculpts or puts a face back on a skull. There's some programs, lots of programs doing in the realm of like age progressions. Everybody constantly has those apps and age progression, age regression, but there's so much goes into the facial approximations that I think that'd be a tall order for somebody to come up with some automated process. Not to say that they can't or they won't one of these days. The technology, so it still has a steep learning curve. So we have the ability to do a CT scan of the skull and do everything, the facial approximation, in that digital environment. It's very high tech, haptic technology. You see the model of the skull, float around in space and then go through and apply that digital clay. It's just like building it in clay, but in a digital environment, like a 3D environment.
Really?
But as the fine artist in me, I prefer the hands-on, sculpting, just my preference. And you can still get that more of a human element to it. I think that's a good way, because I always say, like, doing it in a computer, to me, it still looks like a mannequin. When I sculpt it in clay, it has that, it looks like a bust, a representation of a human being.
So I'll jump ahead a little bit, because I've watched other videos of yours. And one thing that you've said, which I thought was really relevant to my experience, seeing this recreation of this woman who I've known for 25 years come to life. And you basically say, you're done when that person's looking back at you. And I'll let you take it, because that was a moment that sort of triggered it for me. I felt like she was looking at me.
It's tough as my background's in fine art and graphic design. You talk to, and any artist that you talk to, inevitably question comes up, like, how do you know you're done? Like when a painter, you're doing a portrait, how do you know when you put that last brush stroke, or you're doing a pencil,
right.
When that last line is like, when you say, I'm done. I got that question, repeatedly, and then opportunity to do the video for the class, and the question came up again, and it just kind of hit me. I was like, I know when I'm done when I see the person staring back at me. And that was, I love showing that video, because most people I can see them react to that. And they don't, I love saying on a day one, my students, like, you got that, you experienced that, because you've been staring at this skull, and then now you get to see a face. It's that moment it's
powerful. Yeah, I can truly appreciate that, because it was a powerful moment in seeing that now, and it shifted as a representative of a museum. We talk about her as a real person. We work with the Sahar Salim at the Cairo Museum, and we're giving her identity back based on our historical knowledge of her time, her moment walking this planet. So it's not just like the 100-year-old, just a mummy, not even necessarily a human, just a thing, another object in a museum. Now it's a story. Now she's a person, who had a life, who had her struggles and triumphs on this place, and being able to give her a face back, whether, if it's the accuracy level, whatever it might be, is it seems kind. And we're really grateful. We're really grateful to you for that. What inspired you to go into this really unique field?
My origin story.
Yeah.
It's a I'll see if I can condense this. It's one of my favorite stories to tell. I was going down the road of more of a graphic artist. My background's in fine art and graphic design, and a colleague of mine left this design firm I was working on to go get a job at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which turned out it was just a few blocks away from where we were working at the design firm. So he left, and a few weeks later, he invited me over to go join him for lunch or meet him for lunch. It's like, well, I'll walk over. And I had no idea what the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was. So I was just curious. So gave me directions, I walked over there. And as I walked in, I was escorted back to where his desk was. And there was this guy sitting at his desk, like right closest to the door, holding a skull. So that stopped me in my tracks. And I'm kind of looking around like, what is this place? Like, why do you have a skull? But so it was just that chance encounter walking down the hall, and it turns out that particular skull landed there through a miscommunication. It shouldn't even have been there, and that was the moment I walked down the hall. It changed my life. It's like that's the coolest thing ever. I want to be a forensic artist, and here I am. 23 years later.
So just by happenstance.
Yeah, it turns out that they needed, the position became available, not doing forensic art, but to get my foot in the door. They needed some help us doing some imaging stuff. And then soon after I applied, they needed another forensic artist. So I jumped right on that.
That's amazing.
Right. It's just, you have to believe in fate after hearing that kind of story. It was destiny, fate.
I'm glad you said it, because I was thinking it. Surely, I was like, things don't always happen by accident. No. And I will point out, behind you is actually the Barnum Museum's.
Here she is, right here.
Oh,
no, I moved her over. This is a Mongolian monk.
Oh, okay.
Sony.
I can see it now. Okay, so this is her. So introduce everybody. And we were talking a little bit earlier, because I had the good fortune through graduate school. I worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there's so many extraordinary specimens in the collection there, including wigs. Oh. So we were talking about hair. I mean, we didn't even get into that. That's a whole different, path to go down, and certainly, with a particular wig on that would even reflect more of an Egyptian style from 4,000 years ago, would even change her face even more. Just out of curiosity, some folks were asking about other notable cases. Have you ever been on a case that was successfully solved and your work really supported?
Yeah, in my time, there's been, as a forensic artist doing the facial approximation of skeletal remains, I'm the last phone call that any law enforcement agency reaches out to. That's when we mentioned DNA, that DNA is not available. They've exhausted any other avenue. Dental records has not come up. Any missing persons in the area. That it's the coldest. These are the coldest of the cold cases. So when I'm called in to work with the investigator, the anthropologist, to make that facial approximation and get that image, the finished image, out to as many eyes as possible. Because say the remains are found in New York, that does mean the person is from New York. So, and that in the regards of the face that we create has to be seen. It has to be seen by the right person. I can create a portrait, a perfect representation of sculpture of what this person looked like in life, never going to be successful unless the right person sees it. So 7.8 billion people on the planet, I need 7.8 billion people to look at that facial approximation and say, that kind of looks like, my cousin. I haven't seen, her in 10 years, and she, run away or whatever the issue may be. And that's how it works. That 1 out of 7.8 billion people says, I think I know who that is. And that's worked in my career and hundreds of times of cases we've helped. We always say, don't say closure. But the way the service we're providing in the realm of forensic art is we're providing answers to families, because not knowing is a nightmare you can't wake up from. So that's worked. It's worked time and time again where the right person has seen it, made that phone call and said, I believe that's my son, my daughter, or my mom.
Wow.
And all the time I've been doing this, and that question always comes up. I still have not ever been able to articulate what an amazing feeling. That's something I feel like I'm doing something bigger than myself, to that type of service that I can provide to these families. And that's why I want to keep doing it over and over and over and over again. I don't want to see it, and no skull should be left on a shelf, because that's a family that's frozen in uncertainty.
Yeah. Wow. That is a noble cause. And you've probably given peace to a lot of these families through your work.
Certainly hope so.
Another interesting question is, a number of people ask, like, how do you handle the ethical implications of creating a representation of an individual, mainly when they may have been a victim of a crime or trauma?
There's a lot that goes into the treatment of the skulls. We touched on yet that these are individuals. These, whether it's an active investigation of a cold case or a piece of our history in a mummy from 4,000 years ago, still treated with the same respect. Ultimately, these are human beings that need to be treated with respect. And when I'm asked to do the skulls, hopefully all those questions and approvals those hurdles have been leaped over by the time to get to me. And I treat it with the same respect through the chain of custody that they deserve. And I'll make sure I put the right face on there, and ultimately either make an accurate representation of our history or an accurate depiction of what this individual looked like in life, in the hopes to get them identified.
What is interesting about our particular mummy, another expert that we brought in was maxillofacial specialist, who really assessed her teeth. And what we do know is that her teeth were ground, and that she had about 11 severe abscesses in her mouth. So, and she was probably somewhere in a range of about 30 years old. So although that might not have impacted, the recreation of her face, this is a person that probably died in severe, severe pain, potentially of these major abscesses, the infections from these major abscesses in her face.
Having that type of information, there's been times you could see that just an unbelievably horrible, worst of the worst, abscess, which I've had an abscess tooth, and I don't recommend it. It looks like you've got a golf ball in your mouth. It's just that swelling, and that certainly would have compromised her immune system dealing with that type of enormous infection. It basically eats the bone that runs that rampant. Yeah. So in their 30s, that was probably the peak of the life expectancy back then. So having that information, it's like we want to give her the best representations. Like we want, if I was really going to do an accurate representation, she'd probably be a little more gaunt, and have that, you'd be able to see those lumps around her cheek to show that type of infection. And if you would add color, it'd be that massive blood that was going to that face, be all red and inflamed. But that's not what
Right. Maybe that's for another time. As our study advances forward, it's like, what is the impact of something that severe, on a face, right?
You can add that in, digitally pretty easily.
Oh, really? See, that's interesting. That's interesting to be able to do something like that. So later on, when we go through our reinterpretations at the Barnum Museum, that might be something that we could call on you to
Oh yeah.
help us do, particularly, because we're interested in talking to dental students,
Oh,
as absolutely, to really examine this even further. And you're passing it forward. You're teaching these skills to other students. So a number of young people who watched our videos did reach out if this is a path that they want to follow. Where do you go now? It's not, conceivable that everybody's going to stumble onto an office who just received a skull, that changed the trajectory of their life. But
right.
For information to pass along to some of the potential students who are watching this, hopefully this is the moment that's changing their life. It's this video from the Barnum Museum popped up in my feed, and I want to do this. What would you recommend they do first?
Uh, First thing is, in my experience, you have to be a fine artist before you can be a forensic artist. So I would take, study, drawing, portrait sculpting, anything to do with the human face, painting, drawing, sculpting, all of that. That's a great foundation to build on, because don't rely on technology, because it may or may not be there at every, opportunity. So if you can, so all that means that I can do my job with, facial approximations, age progressions. I can do my job with or without a computer. So that's that fine art, experience, background, foundation to build on. So I would tell them, get that fine art, out of the way. If it's something, and this is something you want to do, there's, contacts. It has to be that crossover with, science and law enforcement, because that's where those were the skulls and all the unidentified cases, composite sketches, age progressions of fugitives, age progression of long-term missing children, and then the facial approximation of skeletal remains. There's all that science, art, and law enforcement. That's trifecta that has to work together to come up with these images. So you've got to get your foot in the door with a medical examiner's office or an investigator that's working cold cases. And first step, I would say, I'm happy to pass out my, contact information. I could steer you toward those conferences. The International Association for Identification, where I'm a certified forensic artist, is a great place. They have an annual conference where the who's who of the forensic art world comes and does workshops, and it helps, for potential students to come and, mingle with the pioneers and people doing this type of work. It's all in really who that make those connections, and then see what you can do to get your foot in the door. And I promise to whoever is listening and wants to do this, contact me, and I will make sure that you get put on the right path.
Thank you. No, that's brilliant. And actually, even to elaborate on what you just said, my academic background is really 19th century material culture. 19th century, the history of 19th century museums is within the concept, the confines of that. I'm not an Egyptologist, but precisely about making yourself part of a greater network of scholars, the multidisciplinary approach to this thing. I knew who to reach out to first. And reaching out to Quinnipiac and bioimaging and the anthropologist opened a floodgates of opportunities that led us to you,
right?
That led us to the Cairo Museum. How do we discuss this in today's world? How do we present this new research within, embedded within a 19th century museum and make it relevant today? So there is a lot of different types of researchers and scholars and knowledgeable people that can really take you on a ride that you don't know what the path is going to be. So
there's so many, like you said, there's so many different elements to this, just this one face that we created. There's it's so people see, oh, this is a great, oh, you made this face or whatever. It's like you have no idea what it took to pull this off. All the consolidation and
Oh
collection of
my gosh.
resources that
Well,
has to
when we
happen.
started, you're absolutely right. When we started this process and having a curatorial background, understanding what it's like to transport rare, specialized materials, there were no imaging. We don't have an imaging equipment. The first time we actually did the CAT scans, we had to transport her to another site. So the packing and the logistics of that, we couldn't transport her without a police escort. Think about the insurance aspects of it. So there's that whole component to ensure the safety. And I was not allowed to leave it.
Oh, no.
I was not allowed to leave it. And I won't say who, but when we arrived at the first place that we transported her and rolling, her carefully into the museum, somebody at the site said, "No, you can't go." And I'm like, if I can't go, she can't go. So it was just sort of like,
Handcuffed to the skull.
oh yeah, it was like, so there, so yeah, you're absolutely right. The
Such a
layer
process.
of bringing, teams of people together to make something happen respectfully, with great honor, and then incorporating,
You have to.
the ancient stories.
You got to appreciate it is a piece of our history, and so you got to handle with care.
Absolutely, and that comes first. And happy to say that we do know, who she is now, so we can, relate to her to the human journey, on this planet, and thank her for everything that she lived through, to get us to where we are today.
Right.
So with that, I'm going to let you just kind of wrap up, and I can't thank you enough for being here with us today. I know you're doing another interview and you have something else this afternoon, but for other museums that have objects in their collection that they're not sure about, for students who want to pursue this for this field of reconstruction, whether it's in the museum path or in the medical field, just sum up the life lesson that you've had, that really kind of brought us to this interesting conversation.
So when I first started teaching the class up in New York, I quickly became aware of a need to keep doing this over and over again, to clear the shelves of ME's offices across the U.S. That is my mission, and I'm not going to stop until that happens. Now, rolling that into the opportunity to work with these, historical cases, that also opens up a whole nother, I think, need to put a face to history. Also, the museums out there have, I know for a fact, the Smithsonian had a whole drawer full of Egyptian, skulls, as we were doing that research with the diet and the wear on the teeth. But so what I want to do, if I, using this as a launching pad, why not do this, open up, the Met, the Smithsonian, and give us one of your collections, and we can do this process, find artists that want to do this, and I'm happy to lead the workshop. And let's put a face to history.
That's
not just the kings, the queens, the pharaohs, all that. These are the people who made the kings and the queens, the pharaohs, the everyday face to history, like the you and I of history. Yeah. I think people would. It's a portrait gallery of the faces of history, brought to life. And it's not just a skull that you're going to see; it's a person, and everybody's going to have that moment that we talked about. You're like, it's not just a skull; it's a face. That's what that person looks like, and I think it's next on my to-do list. Is not going to these museums.
I volunteer to help you champion that. I really do, because the work that we've done with you and Quinnipiac and the Cairo Museum has really given us the opportunity to expand these remarkable stories to people and make everything more human. That you come to a museum and it's an emotional journey. It's just not like, oh wow, it transforms you, and ultimately that's the goal. So yeah, I'm all in.
Good.
All in. So with that, we'll wrap up and we'll set you free because you have other things to do. But I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for watching. We absolutely will put your contact information down below if there are students who want to reach out to you to learn about this fascinating journey. And again, you know, if you have, please thumbs up. That helps the Barnum Museum channel. If you can, subscribe if you're not. And we thank you so very, very much. We truly appreciate it, Joe.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Hope to hear from everybody soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.